So I want to thank you for joining us today. I'm Kathy Rowe from New Jersey Advocates for Aging Well, and this is the day after National Healthcare Decisions Day. I want to welcome our speaker, Dr. David Barile. Dr. Barile is the founder and chief medical officer of Goals of Care Coalition of New Jersey, which is a nonprofit partnering with healthcare providers, government agencies, and other organizations. And they're dedicated to helping patients get the care they need and no less, and the care they want and no more, which I think is a very important distinction. Goals of Care provides tools and information to help facilitate the conversations about medical decisions that really reflect a person's wishes. In addition to his roles with Goals of Care, Dr. Barile is the director of Palliative Medicine Services and the medical director of Acute Care for the Elderly Unit at Penn Medicine, Princeton. I got all of that right. He is also the medical director at Princeton Care Center Skilled Nursing Facility, Greenwood Hospice, and the Golden View Memory Home. So I want to thank him for joining us today. I'm going to ask all of you, if you don't mind, if you would put in the chat your name, organization, and your title or role.
Or calling from a doctor's office, press.
Sorry, we're going to mute. If you please keep yourselves on mute until we get to the question and answer part, please. So if you would put in the chat your name, your organization, and your title or role. Like, are you a social worker, a nurse, a healthcare provider? We'd like to get an idea of who is with us today. And I also want to tell people we are offering social work CEs for this today through Monmouth University. So if you are interested, I'm going to put it in the chat. If you are still interested in signing up for that, you can follow that link. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Barile. Go ahead.
Thanks, Kathy. And I'll just start sharing my screen and giving you an introduction here. Thanks, everyone, for having me. Allow me to just pull up some slides. And get my screen ready to go. So the topic is primer on palliative care. And as I'm setting these slides up, it's going to take a while here. There's so much stuff on the screen. As I'm setting these slides up, I'll share with you that, so my opinion about palliative care, and it isn't I have a kind of an interesting opinion about palliative care. And I think it's shared by a lot of people in the business. And the title of this is a primer on palliative care, but I want to start with just giving you guys this information. And that is, if you look at a textbook of palliative medicine, for example, the Oxford textbook of palliative medicine, or look through any of the one in palliative care, all of the topics will fall into one of two categories. Be sure to mute your devices there if you're not speaking. All of the topics will fall into one of two categories, right? If you looked at the topics of the journal articles or the chapters in the textbooks. So the first category is essentially communication, and the second is symptom management. So when learning about palliative care in training, we learn how to communicate well to others. We learn how to set family meetings. We learn how to break bad news. We learn how to establish goals of care and so on, cross-cultural communication techniques. We also learn, part two, the second group of the second topic, we learn how to treat symptoms. So we have expertise in how to treat pain, how to treat nausea, how to treat insomnia, agitation, and so on. And that's essentially the crux of what palliative medicine does at the bedside. So I want you to understand that, and I want to point that out because a lot of people think it's just something mysterious. It's actually just good medicine. So if you think about it, it's sort of absurd. I'm a lumper and not a splitter. I can whine and complain that we've even created this subspecialty. I think it should have been all embedded in general medicine. All doctors, all clinicians, all practitioners at the bedside need to be able to, communicate well to the decision maker, the patient or surrogate, and treat symptoms. So it's just good medicine. So please don't think of it as anything kind of mysterious. There's nothing mysterious about palliative care or palliative medicine. It's just good doctoring. It's good communication skills. It's goal setting. It's treating symptoms in the context of a serious illness. So that's my kickoff statement on palliative care, and I'm happy to hear opinions about that moving forward. But essentially what I'll do during this talk now, I'll give you a little outline in just a moment, but the talk has two parts. I'm first going to give you a little bit of a history lesson, and I want to, in order to make a point that palliative care and hospice care, those movements that happened over the previous few decades, are responses to our modern medical establishment that really found its form in the 1950s. So I'll give you a little history on how hospice and then palliative care kind of evolved in response to very aggressive care at the bedside. And then the second half or second part of this, I'll give you a 4-step model of communication, a very simple 4-step model to use when having conversations around important decisions. So I'm going to ask whoever's got their, just please, everybody check their mic and silent their mic because there's some background noise that I'm hearing. So if, for those of you who haven't visited our website, please do, goalsofcare.org. We are a coalition of over 30 members and going strong, devoted to improving palliative medicine services and advocacy across the state. We've got a great history, have a great present, and a really, really promising future. And there are a lot of resources on our website, goalsofcare.org, and I'll plug those again later on. But resources that I refer patients to prior to having these conversations, so they can look at a video on a pulse form, right, before I have that pulse conversation. I can look at a video on hospice care before I have that conversation, and it helps with time efficiency, right? So just a brief outline, like I mentioned, we'll talk about history and specifically point out gaps in education, particularly the medical educational system. I'll try to make a few points in that, like I mentioned, hospice and palliative medicine are kind of responses to the medical establishment. And hopefully covering this history, it'll sort of illuminate also to all of us why these goals of care conversations just don't happen when we think they should happen. And then second part, I'll offer you this 4-step model for medical decision making. It's a script that basically aligns personal goals of care with available therapies. And while we're talking about these steps, well, I'll also point out some gaps in communication, some sort of missing pieces, right? And I'll tell you what they are now. Health literacy, how to establish health literacy, how to improve cross-cultural communication, and how not to bring your own baggage into this conversation. So even if you're not on the front lines of this stuff, I think most of you are, your friends or family may be, right? Eventually all of us will be. So this information I'm giving you today, you may want to take off your work hat and just try to enjoy it and appreciate it as something that's a life lesson, or hopefully information that will help you with communication over all aspects moving forward. But all right, we'll start with some history now, and I'll point out why these conversations really happen. And I think the reason why I want to talk about medical history is because I want you to understand how doctors think and how we're wired and how we are products of our educational institutions and the mindset of the physician and the healthcare, I would say the healthcare ecosystem within which we're all working, right, is designed to set us up for failure around these goals of care conversations. And it's mainly because how doctors learn medicine, how medicine is taught. Most doctors essentially are hardwired to perform two basic functions. And those are number one, how to make the diagnosis, and number two, how to treat that diagnosis, right? And I first got a sense of this in medical school. And this is kind of a long story. I'll try to truncate it, but I was applying to medical school. I was having an interview in medical school, and it was going really well. And there were like three guys around the table, three older seasoned physicians peppering me with questions. And it was like an hour into it, it was almost over. And just as it was ending, like the last 10 minutes, I was thinking to myself, oh my God, I'm doing pretty well. I think I'm going to be a doctor. I was getting really excited. And then finally the attending asked, we just have one more question for you, David. And I thought to myself, uh-oh, I'm going to blow it. Here it goes. And they essentially, they described a patient who was a child, 12-year-old kid with cystic fibrosis, in and out of the hospital, now on a ventilator. And this was like 20, nearly 30 years ago. And there was no treatment at that time for this child. And I knew that they basically just described a child that was dying in the ICU. And the final question after they presented this case to me was, David, what do you tell the mother? And I thought to myself, for a quick second, I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to console the mother, offer her, support and emotional support, and do the best we can during this end of life situation. And so on, I looked up at these guys, and they all were staring at me, and I thought to myself, uh-oh, that's not the answer they want. And I shared with them, well, I'll offer the mother hope. And I'll tell her that there's always research around the corner, and we've got to hope for the best. And there's always new promising therapy coming about. And they all nodded their heads in agreement. They signed something in their charts, closed it, and said, thank you very much. And I walked out of there thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I just BS'd my way into medical school. And I think about that all the time now. These doctors, I mean, the first few years after that, I thought, my God, these guys are crazy. There was something wrong here. What's missing? And since that encounter, I've always paid really close attention as to who is teaching me and what are they teaching me. Now, when I look back at this and I think about those guys and what their intentions were with that question, they were, I think, focusing on hope, right? And they didn't want to hurt this child or hurt this mother. They were well-intentioned. They weren't bad doctors. They were wired to offer this mother hope. And hope, particularly false hope, can be a dangerous thing. And we won't have time to talk about hope too much during this, but I'll tell you right now that I stopped using that word hope at the bedside. I use the word cope. I've changed the H to a C. How can I help you cope with this problem? What can I do to help you cope with this, right? And there's all kinds of stuff in research here that suggests hope may be harmful, and we can come back to that. Prisoners given a life sentence with no chance of parole versus a chance of parole, adapt better. I'm digressing a little bit, but it's a question that we can address at the end if you guys want to talk more about hope. But this is, of course, from a really famous painting called The Doctor, 1891, and it depicts a doctor observing this very critical stage in the child's illness, where the parents are sort of hopeless and helpless, and the doctor is incredibly attentive, focused on this child as a person and an individual, right? And the point here of me showing you this is to ask this question, like, how did we go from this guy to that doctor that just spends 20 minutes with each patient, or zips in and out of your nursing home and rubber stamps the chart and so on? And I'm one of those doctors, so I don't mean to throw anybody under the bus, but many still expect doctors to behave this way, like the guy in the painting. And when we enter medical school, this is our intention, but we come out the other end is like data processors and staring at our computer screen. And the role here, the role historically for doctoring was to relieve suffering and heal the patient. And for centuries, this was the role of the doctor, right? To palliate symptoms and offer relief. And the role of the doctor began to shift around the time that this painting was painted in the 1800s. And it was around the mid to late 1800s that people began, or doctors began, to specialize and to begin to focus on an organ of interest and not the whole patient. And a good example of the early specialist, I think, is this man from the 1800s, and this is Dr. Marion Sims. And Dr. Sims is considered to be the founder of OBGYN. He made advancements in the field, helped combine obstetrics and gynecology, and he developed these sort of pioneering tools to help with reproductive health. And wealthy people backed him, and he thrived. And for those of you who know Dr. Sims, we'll come back to him at the end of this talk. But in the late 1800s, an enterprising young doctor would invent a new procedure, build a practice around it, and appeal to wealthy donors to support this practice. And this practice would be to promise, right, the future or advance science through clinical research. And this model continues to this day. You know, family donates a lot of money to a hospital. The wing is named after the family, and so on. So new specialists, though, had faced a lot of opposition, and to the established generalists really didn't kind of like them. They didn't want to give up any part of the body. In fact, in 1859, Paris Faculty of Medicine, which was the most prestigious group of the time, claimed that they didn't want to create chairs in subspecialties, claiming that it suggested intellectual narrow-mindedness, right? And it would disturb sort of seeing the whole view of the patients. Well, you know, as technology evolved and developed, and research led to new understanding, specialism prevailed, and as we all know, took over. And I think that it was in the 1950s that we saw the role and the purpose of the physician move most dramatically from relief of suffering, right, and to cure and avoiding deaths at all costs. And the attention, and this is really important, the attention, that word's really important, the attention of the medical educational system shifted from the relief of suffering to preventing death, and to teaching doctors how to fix a problem. And one of the most important events that occurred in the 1950s was actually the resuscitation of this dog called Nosy. It was the first time folks were able to reanimate a living mammal. Basically, they described CPR. CPR was described in the 1950s. They took this poor little doggy, killed it, euthanized it, and then resuscitated the heart. And you know, over the next decade or so, academic departments started forming around organs, and that's because, like, the researchers got very excited about resuscitation. The community did, the academic community, the government did. The government began pouring a lot of money into subspecialty research. And then what happened, academic departments began forming around all of these lines of funding. So you saw heart doctors come out, you saw kidney doctors come out, and so on. In the 1950s, away went the primary care doctor, and in came all of these specialists. And given the early successes of things like you know, pneumococcal pneumonia being treated with penicillin, people began to think that everything could be cured, right? And this cult of cure developed. And we began turning out specialists like this guy. This guy was phenomenal. This guy was absolutely brilliant, Dr. Kolff. And he created the hemodialysis machine. He created some organ transplant interventions and so on. All really good things that we can still benefit from. But like technology today is moving too fast for us to keep up, so were medical advancements in the healthcare system. And we were really not prepared for what was to come next. And in the 1950s, the trick seemed to be to break down the body into a machine, right, and into its constituent parts and figure out how to keep all of these parts working. And if the parts are damaged, replace the broken parts. And if we could fix all the parts, and perhaps we could even live forever, right? I'm sorry, it's a very Mary Shelley statement, but it began to be very similar to science fiction, the approach at least. This approach in medicine followed the teachings of this guy, French philosopher René Descartes, who argued that all operational things, such as animals and trees, can be reduced to the mechanisms of its parts in operation. So similar to a clock marking the hours by means of its internal gears. And his drawings, really beautiful drawings, on how the body worked were beautiful, but in theory, like, it really didn't pan out. People grew old, developed chronic disease, and this new system was incapable of fixing these problems. So this was the state of affairs in medicine during the 1950s and 60s, and it resulted in tremendous advancements in medicine, like all really good stuff. People began to live longer and spend more time with their families, but for many, these interventions were not saving lives, but prolonging deaths and imposing a lot of burdens on families and of course patients. And so it was inevitable that what I call a backlash would occur. So this backlash was really to this subdivision of labor that happened, and the deconstruction of the patient. And the backlash resulted in the formation of the medical hospice benefit and the creation of the palliative medicine subspecialty. And of course, it kind of continues to this day, but I'll introduce you to a few people who responded to the medical ecosystem of the 1950s and 60s, and that impacted, we'll say, hospice and palliative medicine. And we've got to mention this woman. She was incredible. The backlash actually happened on both sides of the Atlantic, and it really began with this woman, Dame Cicely Saunders. And she's often credited as the founder of the modern hospice movement. She's a nurse by trade, but then became a social worker and then became a physician. So she was kind of a multidisciplinary group all rolled up into one. And she took a special interest in the neglect of the dying patient. And Dame Cicely emphasized, I would say, the biopsychosocial model, and described the concept of what she called total pain, meaning that suffering can occur within any realm and not necessarily just from bodily pain. And this is suffering that I think that she would argue is tantamount to any physical suffering. So if we ignore these other elements of suffering, we fail to heal the patient. And this was her main message. It was a very holistic approach, but really, really radical for the time. Florence Wald was her American counterpart, Dean of Yale School of Nursing. She founded the first hospice, very active in the early 70s. This guy, Lewis Kuttner, was a human rights attorney, and he actually described the very first living will. He was a futurist, and he could see what was happening, that doctors were just sort of preventing death, right? And that was the patient's right to write down and to document a living will. He was the first guy to do this. And it's kind of interesting. It was met with a lot of resistance. Doctors felt like it was euthanasia. And to be able to read off of a living will and then remove someone from a ventilator. You can draw, and we can talk about this at the end, but you can draw some similar parallels, I think, to the medical aid in dying effort that's happening here now in this country and our response to that. I don't mean to render an opinion about medical aid in dying, but it sort of like stirred up the community as much as the advanced directive movement did. But this really impacted the living will and the concept of living will. But it was 1969 that Lewis Kuttner published the first living will, and this is when it all started, advanced care planning. This really impacted the patient autonomy movement. So with this, right, people began saying, like, wait a minute, it's my body, and whose life is it anyway, right? So I really want to be informed about my own medical decisions and so on. And of course, Kubler-Ross in the late 60s was very much part of this backlash, and I can't leave her out. And she's widely known for her work in dying patients. And of course, she published on death and dying, and most of you are familiar with these stages. But in 72, she testified before the US Senate and Special Committee on Aging and about the right to die and so on, and really had a pretty big impact on how the government began to think about this stuff. And you all know about Karen Ann Quinlan, and I won't tell you the whole story, but for those of you who don't, she was a teenager in the mid-70s who overdosed and was in a persistent vegetative state. This is a really powerful photograph of her parents, who advocated to, or asked, after counseling with their Catholic priest, went to the doctors and asked that she be removed from the ventilator, and the doctors, the hospital administrators, and the physicians responsible for her care refused, on the grounds that to do so would be euthanasia, in their eyes, murder. And the position was no different from the AMA at the time. So the parents went on to challenge this in court, and where they were successful. And really, I think in the mid-70s, this really laid the groundwork for ethics committees to be set up within hospital systems, and the groundwork for the Self-Determination Act and for the hospice movement, really importantly. And this is, I know that Reagan was not signing the hospice benefit when this picture was taken. This is a stock image. There's probably some big tax cut. But the benefit was signed in 1982. It wasn't until 86 that the Medicare hospice benefit was enacted, and states were given the option to include hospice in their Medicaid programs. But hospice care was made available to the terminally ill nursing home residents as well, like after a couple of years in the mid 80s. Now, there's one big problem with the hospice benefit that you probably all know, and that's it's an all or nothing service, right? So you either you're getting everything done, or you're on hospice, and it becomes a very abrupt transition. And the second problem with hospice is that the government pays just about, and now I think the rate is about up to $180 a day, which is really not a lot of money. It's kind of a lousy benefit. I get to think of the tens of thousands of dollars that Medicare pays in the months leading up to hospice while the person's in and out of the ICU, right? And then when they elect comfort with hospice, what happens? They kind of nickel and dime you to death, and causing families to go broke and impacting the economy, and because people have to leave work to take care of their loved ones. So it's really not a very, I'm a big hospice advocate, but when you really look at it, it could be a much better benefit. But so for the 2 decades, all we had was this all or nothing option, and it was it was hospice that was the only sort of palliation available, and people, leaders in the field, began calling for care that was patient-centered, focused more on personal goals in the setting of a prognosis, and care that can relieve suffering, that can be offered concurrently alongside curative measures. So finally, in 2006, palliative medicine as a subspecialty arrived on the scene. And when this subspecialty was created, the American Board of Medical Subspecialties announced this discipline, and it released this very bold statement, and I want to read it to you because I think it sums it up nicely. The principles of palliative medicine are rooted in the distinction between curing and healing. Curing refers to treating a physical illness, while healing refers to the inner sense of peace, coherence, and purpose the patient finds, even in the midst of an incurable condition. So it should occur to all of you at this moment in time that these are the basic functions of medicine, that all practitioners should be able to do this, right? There lies my beef in the medical educational system, right? And that I mentioned with my introduction. So it's worth pointing out that perhaps embedding these principles into mainstream medicine may have been better than creating another subspecialty. But there we have it. Like I mentioned, I'm a lumper, not a splitter, but this means, though, that unless the doctor attending a very progressive medical school and then residency training, unless they're exposed to some of this, palliative medicine in their general curriculum, they're not going to get any of it unless they go out and do do a subspecialty, right? Unless they do a fellowship. So this is a problem because the need for palliative medicine will grow, or is growing, by about 20% over the next decade, and the workforce is only growing by about 2%. So there's not going to be enough palliative medicine teams around to handle the need. So mainstream medicine is still focused on this two-step method of diagnosing and treating, diagnosing and treating, diagnosing and treating. And what happens is these people leave the hospital systems and they spend their, final time in skilled nursing facilities. I know a lot of you are looking in or working in subacute rehabs or skilled nursing facilities, assisted livings. I'm just doing a time check here because excuse me for a moment. Halfway through. Okay, we're doing okay with time. So that's my history. And before I go into the 4 steps here, I just to kind of summarize, and I'm sorry if that was uninteresting for some of you, but for me, it really helps me make sense of the absolute chaos that happens when a frail elder traverses a hospital system or skilled nursing facility system and bounces in and out, meets a bunch of strangers who are focused in on their organ of interest, and nothing ever gets done, right? In terms of establishing prognosis, goal setting, deciding what people want and don't want, right? And aligning goals of care with available therapies, right? That only happens if they happen to be, exposed to a palliative medicine consult along the way. The purpose of the rest of this exercise here for the remaining half hour is to empower you guys, empower you all to do it yourselves. It's actually not too difficult. And I want to introduce you now to a 4-step method that captures a lot of palliative medicine principles and is something that we can embed into our discussions at the bedside. So we'll focus in on some gaps that exist too while we're talking about this stuff. So aligning goals of care with available therapies. This is our logo for goals of care. Please, again, check out our website. A lot of resources there, goalsofcare.org. But I want to start with, before I show you the 4-step model, I'll show you the existing model, which we all do at the bedside. 2-step model, the model of the 1950s and 60s. This is how I learned medicine in medical school. I learned every single thing there was to learn about making the diagnosis of congestive heart failure. How do you take the history? What questions do you ask? How do you examine the patient? What tests to order to confirm that diagnosis? I then learned, step 2, every single thing there was to learn to treat congestive heart failure, all the evidence-based medicine, right? But never in my training did anyone ever tell me or teach me how to distinguish between 2 congestive heart failure patients, one that might live another decade or 2, and the other who may die in a week or 2, right? We never learned about prognostication. We never learned goal setting. So, it's a really, I don't mean to dismiss and trash this 2-step model. Just last week, I had high fevers, chills, feeling lousy. I pulled a tick off of my skin I had recalled a week prior. I called my doctor, told her what was going on. She ordered some blood tests, ordered the doxycycline. Blood test came back. I had an unusual tick-borne infection. I felt better in a couple of days with the doxycycline. I needed the diagnosis. I needed the treatment. I may have died without that doxycycline, but I didn't die. I felt better in a couple of days and was back to work. And when you're expecting a full recovery, this is the key point here, the key message about the 2 steps. If you're expecting a full recovery and you're expecting to get better, right? All of us on this call, I assume if we got sick, we'd want to get better. Then the 2-step model works perfectly fine, right? It works perfectly fine. The 2-step model fails when that person is entering into a final phase of life or has a life-limiting disease, we'll say, right? That's where it fails us. So how can we improve? This is the other point to make here is that, people, for those of you who may have had cancer or exposed to cancer syndromes or family or friends, a lot of people don't know whether their chemotherapy is curative, remissive, or palliative, right? Am I giving chemotherapy to cure this person? Am I giving it to buy some time? Am I giving it just to treat symptoms so that they die a peaceful death? People just don't know this stuff. They're not informed. So we'll come back to this. So here's the 4-step model. And you can see that we've added 2 steps and 2 really, really important steps. So look at this screen. On the left side, it's for those who can be cured. On the right side, those who cannot be cured or have a life-limiting disease, chronic progressive disease, right? And this is the script for the 4-step goals of care conversation. And if you go to our website, you'll see the iCare plan. We call it the iCare plan. It's a tool. We have videos on this. We've had paper printout scripts that decision makers can bring to their doctor's office and take notes. We've even got some for the doctors. But I'll give you a quick example of 2 patients that I had. A couple of years ago, I was on teaching service and I had 2 patients come into the hospital and both were in their 80s, both were healthy, high functioning elders living independently. One of them I actually knew peripherally, but they both came in with the exact same diagnosis, exact same prognosis. Both had devastating strokes. Really bad strokes. They were alert, they were oriented, they could communicate, but they couldn't swallow, couldn't speak well. Half of their body was paralyzed. They needed a feeding tube in the stomach because they couldn't swallow and so on. We went into the first guy's room and shared with him that he had a stroke. To the best of our ability, we shared the prognosis after speaking with the neurologist and the rehab people, that this man might live a couple of more years if he didn't have another stroke, likely in a nursing home setting. He'd need a feeding tube in the stomach that may be taken out in the future if he could swallow again, but he would be dependent on care. When we asked, and so that's step 1 and 2, right? Step 3, we asked him what are his goals of care in the context of this prognosis that he just heard. And he shared with us that he just wanted to go back to listen to his wife's music. He was a musician. He had been married to a pretty famous concert pianist. This guy woke up in the morning, turned the music on, turned the music off, went to bed. This guy's listening to music made his life worth living. That made his day, right? And so he had the funds to hire help and go home. And that's just what he did. He got the feeding tube. He went to rehab, I think for a short couple of weeks, then went home and hired 24/7 help. The next patient, patient number 2, on paper, it's the same case, the same exact problem. Healthy elder female, she was a retired botanist and a gardener, worked vigorous in her front lawn, planting and stuff. I would see her on my way to work. And we shared with her her prognosis and so on. We shared that, she wanted to get back to gardening. When we asked her what her goals are, I want to get back to gardening. And we shared with her that, well, maybe she can do some potting with one hand in the nursing facility, but she's not going to get back to vigorous gardening. And she asked basically, what else would we have? And we talked about other palliative options in hospice, and she elected hospice. So point here is, same exact diagnosis, same exact prognosis, 2 totally different goals of care, 2 totally different treatment modalities for the different patients, right? The statin, the cholesterol pill that we wanted to give this woman, totally futile. Doesn't help her achieve her goal. The physical medicine rehab consult, futile, doesn't help her achieve her goal. What she needed was the hospice referral. So really important. And again, just to emphasize goalsofcare.org, and you guys can check out more of this. So I want to stay on these 4 steps for a few more minutes and discuss some key components, right? These are the gaps that are missing. And one is prognosis. We'll talk about prognostication. We'll talk about health literacy and cross-cultural communication. And, I shared with you that doctors aren't well instructed on prognosis, but this is an important question. Most doctors can answer this question. And if you ask the doctor, if you're trying to help someone with decision-making, you ask, well, doctor, would you be surprised if this guy died in the next year? Yes or no? And there's some conflicting evidence here, but I think it's a decent question to ask. So, and what I do, when I'm talking to family members, I'll ask them, would it be helpful to learn about prognosis? Maybe I can ask the doctor if the patient is entering into, your loved one is in the final year or so, because we're all worried, and that may be helpful information. And most doctors can answer that question. The other really high yield question to ask, and this gets into health literacy now, is what's your understanding of your condition? Good news or bad, I start every healthcare conversation with this question. What's your understanding of your prognosis? What's your understanding of your disease, right? Because it helps you kind of zero in on what their health literacy is. Sometimes they'll just look up from the bed and they'll say, I'm dying, and I know that I'm dying, right? And so, but other times they're totally clueless. But really important high yield take home point for you guys is that previous question, doctor, would you be surprised if the patient is in their last year of life, yes or no? Another take home point here, start every conversation with what's your understanding. Now, to get to the cross-cultural point here, before you start these goals of care conversations, before you start doing this stuff, you want to find out how big decisions are made. So this is where you get to the cultural sensitivity of all of this. Who should be here with you? I want to talk to you about some important decisions moving forward, Mrs. McGillicuddy. How do you make big decisions in your family? Should we call your son? Should we call your uncle? And so on. Really important. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to build trust, right? That's the whole point of this. And I did a lot of research in fellowship on Holocaust survivors. What I learned is that Holocaust survivors who disclosed their trauma to their doctors had more, and their doctors knew what they had been through, had more trust in them. And we know that trust improves outcomes, right? On this topic of trust, I want to make a few points about the African-American population. We know that African-American communities are less likely to engage in hospice care and palliative medicine and seek out more aggressive care at the end of life. And this may be in part, I think, as a result of the lack of trust that exists within African-American communities in healthcare. And we know about Tuskegee and all those historical traumas, but there's a lot more that I think many of us don't know. Research, by the way, from previous decades shows that people of color are less likely to receive adequate pain control when hospitalized. And this history really spans generations. The distrust is deeply rooted in American history. It goes back to the times of slavery. This is Dred Scott, who in 1857 sued for his freedom after he was 4 years in a free state. The Chief Justice declared, of the Supreme Court, declared that a Negro was worth only 3/5 of a white man, and therefore an inferior being of separate species who could not be a citizen. And this ruling gave legal status to prejudice, stereotyping, discrimination, and so on, had really ramifications all across the field. And of course, in healthcare, and it aided and abetted the government in its racial discrimination by creating separate but equal hospitals and so on. The guy I mentioned earlier, Marion Sims, the father of OBGYN, practiced his surgical procedures on slaves without, of course, without anesthesia, right? Certainly without consent or anesthesia. So this, of course, is the history, I think, of the lack of trust that the African-American population has in the medical community. I don't trust you to manage my blood pressure. I'm certainly not going to trust you around any end-of-life activity. It's true that the African-Americans have less knowledge of hospice and end-of-life care. But I want to point out some really interesting research on health literacy in the African-American population. When you drill down to health literacy, those differences go away. The differences in electing or not electing hospice care. If someone understands, regardless of the color of your skin or race, whatever you want to call it, if someone understands the diagnosis and prognosis and options, then they're likely to elect the best course of action, right? But it's all about trust, right? We've got to build trust. You build trust, with trust comes healing. And if they don't trust you to heal them, we're all going to suffer. We're kind of out of time now. I really wanted to plug this book. This book really changed, I would say, how I think about so many things. It's this book that's, you may have heard in the news, pulled off the shelf in that small town in Texas, but it's a very powerful book. You know, I grew up pretty enlightened about so-called race, very progressive Italian-American family. Hate was not taught in my household. I thought I was an enlightened guy. When I picked up this book, I thought I'd just read more of what I already knew. Completely wrong. It changed my perspective on a lot of things here. I'm going to end with this. We've just have 10 minutes now, and I'm going to speed talk through this slide. This is my last slide, and it's on cultural intelligence. And we all bring our own baggage to the conversation. And I want to introduce you to this term, cultural intelligence. And it's a more, I think, enlightened approach to cross-cultural communication than the old cultural competency, right? It essentially means understanding cross-cultural communication as a process rather than an end product. This should be our goal, right? From this perspective, you know, it moves from gaining factual knowledge or the competency to reevaluating your ongoing attitudes, your own attitudes towards culture and towards race and so on. And there are basically 4 components of it. You've got to have, to improve your cultural intelligence, you've got to have the drive, you've got to want to learn, right? You've got to have some factual knowledge of the culture. You've got to have a strategy to build it into your conversation. And then when you're done interacting with people who are different from you, when you walk away, you've got to do some self-analysis. What did I do? What do I do good? What did I do wrong? Right? The other day, I gave, I had to break the bad news to the son of a 100-year-old woman who was entering a final phase of life. I thought I did a great job. Sat down with this guy, shared all of the right things, elicited goals of care, and I spent about 20 or 30 minutes with him. By the way, these conversations do not need to be an hour long. I don't think they should be longer than 30 minutes. If it's longer than 30 minutes, start over the next day. It's the quality, not the quantity of time. But my point here is, at the end of this conversation, we kind of did some goal setting, and then he looked up and he's like, okay, but let me just run it by my brother. And I thought, gosh, damn it, I did it again. I didn't ask who should we be talking to? How do we make decisions in your family? How is it done? And then I had to do the whole thing again the next day with his brother, or the 2 of them together. It wasn't a big deal, but you know, you forget to do these things. And I'll remember to ask that question in the next several weeks. And then in a couple of weeks, I'll forget and I'll have to do the same thing over. But my point here is, you need a strategy. And part of my strategy is to ask those screening questions. You know, what's your understanding of what's going on? Who should we be talking to? I want to talk about something important now. And that's how you, and then what's important. The other point about trauma I should mention is, you've got to ask about history. Who should, you know, tell me about previous experiences. I'm going to stop the screen share. If anybody can tell me who this lady is, I'll give you some extra credit. And we've got just 10 minutes for questions. And I don't know if there are questions in
Okay.
chat, Kathy, or
Yeah, I pulled you off the spotlight so that we could see if people have questions. If you want to use the raise hand function, I think that might be easiest.
I raced through a lot of stuff, guys.
Yeah.
The point of the first half, we've got to look at the climate that we're working in. It's a very dysfunctional climate, and palliative medicine and hospice are efforts to kind of right that pendulum that swung so far towards the cult of cure and take a more holistic approach. And then the second half, the 4-step model, think about using it in conversation. What's the diagnosis? What's the prognosis? Now that you understand the prognosis, what's important in the context of this time? And step 4, how can I help you achieve your goals? Jean Calment is the woman in the picture. She was the oldest living person on record, 126 years, I believe she lived.
And a smoker.
And a smoker. She drank port wine.
So one of the questions is, when people are looking at a doctor for palliative care, is there a designation? Is there a way for them to know, credentials or initial, a way for them to know that this doctor is?
There's not, unless you look it up. You can look up getpalliativecare.org. We're working, our Goals of Care now is working on an effort to build a database of palliative care providers across the state, and we can expect that within the next year or two. We're doing some research right now. But so you could be your fellowship chained, and if you look a doctor up, it'll say that, but you won't say it after their name necessarily. But there are nurse practitioners who are trained in palliative medicine also. But getpalliativecare.org may be a resource. It's really hard to get palliative medicine out in the community. That's one of the problems with the state. When you send folks to the hospital, most hospital services have a palliative care service line. But once you're out of the hospital system, it's hard to get.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? All right. I think you covered everything.
Well, I was hoping to get some questions here at the end, but I sped through all of that. That was the first time I gave this talk, and maybe I'll chop some sections out so I can go a little more slowly. But the point, the point here is, we get so angry at the establishment, and we get so angry at these doctors that just sort of send people out of the hospital without having these conversations. We blame each other for all of these things going wrong in our medical ecosystem. But I think there's really just one thing to blame, and that's the educational system. We're just not learning this stuff properly. And we all come out very dysfunctional in our approach, and focusing in on organs of interest and so on. And it's really a challenge. It's an uphill battle, but keep the faith. And I think that we've got to set good examples. I think that this is one thing I'm learning as I get older. What is the purpose of life? What the purpose of what we're all doing here? I think one of the things we're forgetting is that we're all role models for one another. And if you set good role models for your family, for your children, they'll go on to set good role models. And you all should have written advance directives. For those who do not, please think about doing it. Think about your own health. Think about how you would behave if you were sick and so on, what you would want and not want, what you would expect from your doctors. But be good role models.
We have a question from Catherine, who I just lost on my screen. I unmuted you, Catherine. If you would go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm an advanced practice nurse in Northern New Jersey in long-term care and subacute. And when I have my goals of care conversations with family members, it's really important to educate them on what services are available at the facilities. I have EKGs, we can do IV antibiotics. We have a lot of diagnostic testing available, to us. We can transfuse iron in some facilities. We can do blood transfusions. So that really helps shape goals of care and treatment versus sometimes sending people out to the hospitals. So it's really important just to educate on what services are available. We talk about the 1950s and 60s models. Long-term care now is based on 1950s, 60s. Long-term care now is med-surg. And that's really, really important. We're, mostly understaffed. So I just really wanted to point that out, people who are social workers, whoever, people in long-term care to,
that's particularly important, and when I'm so glad you brought that up, and I think that it's really important to point out for that frail elder who is in a long-term care facility with dementia, for example, how that readmission, how that ER visit and hospitalization exacerbates the dementia and accelerates it, and most have such a traumatic time. And understanding that we can do most of the things on a general medical floor, most of those things we can do, perhaps not as fast, but we can do them in a skilled nursing facility, IV fluids and antibiotics and so on, all the things that Kathy mentioned. So on the pulse form, for many of my patients, I'm finding that in section B, to check off limited interventions, but avoid hospitalization, if able, is an appropriate goals of care match for many of these frail elders. Once health literacy is established, once the families understand that going back and forth to the ER will just maybe even accelerate mom's death, right? So great point, Catherine. Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, if there aren't any other questions, we will close this out. I thank you, Dr. Barile, for, I'm sorry, Adrian Alotny.
I apologize. Yeah, I'm sorry. I apologize. Just because of what you just are ending with, how often will you update a post form? Is that something that we should be aware of? Like how often a doctor will do that?
Yeah, there's a lot of really good information on Pulse on our website if you want to check that out. But the quick skinny on that is the Pulse form doesn't expire. You should address the Pulse form with any major change in illness. Either the guy got suddenly much better or suddenly much worse, or any transition from a hospital system. So, hey, mom just came back from the hospital. Now here's the Pulse form. Is it up to date? Or here's a new admission. They came in with a Pulse form. Is this current? This is what it says. Or look, we've just discovered metastatic cancer on this screen. Should we readdress the Pulse form and so on? It's not an annual thing, or it's probably a good idea to address it annually, but it doesn't expire. It should be addressed with any admission, discharge, or change in condition. Great question.
And for the last question, I'll go back to Catherine Carlton. Has her hand up again?
Yeah, thanks. For long-term care, I always, will review that on a quarterly basis, as an as-needed basis. A lot of people have a lot of guilt for placing a family member in long-term care, and they feel like if we go into DNR, DNI, DNH, there's a lot of guilt associated with that. So I will fill out a Pulse form and I will advocate and say, you can change this as often as you would like. And I've literally ripped up a Pulse form just to show them, hey, we can toss this in the garbage. It's really empowering them and making family members not feel guilty about goals of care and providing the right care.
I think empowering is a really important point here. And I often, when folks want everything done, you know what I mean by that. I still fill out a Pulse form showing full therapeutic efforts just for that point of communicating to the decision maker that there is a mechanism in place so that they may be heard. And that and of course for that ER doctor to see, so that they know that we actually had the conversation. Yeah, good.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Barile, for this presentation. It has been recorded. We will be sharing it with all the registrants and put it on our website. And we hope that we continue these conversations. But thank you very much, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
All right.